People think a car crash is over the moment the engine dies. They're wrong. Sometimes the real horror begins after impact, when a safety guardrail turns into a spear, when a red light means nothing at 130 miles per hour, when fire locks the doors and a modern car becomes a coffin. These aren't just accidents, they're nightmares caught in daylight. Stay with me, because the question isn't how they crashed, it's why they never stood a chance. Hannah Immer's The Guardrail That Became a Spear. November 1st, 2016, McMinn County, Tennessee. The road was quiet after Halloween night. 17-year-old Hannah Immers was simply driving home with a friend after an evening that should have ended like any other teenage night. Hannah was not racing. She was not speeding. She was a brilliant student, the oldest of 10 children, already holding a diploma at just 15. To her family, she was the responsible one, the girl with a future that seemed almost limitless. Somewhere along the highway, the car drifted slightly. Hannah corrected the steering wheel, but the tires caught the median and the vehicle slid toward the guardrail. It was supposed to be a safety device called the Lindsay X-Light, engineered to collapse during crashes and absorb the impact. It was designed to save lives. That was the promise, but the promise failed. Instead of bending, the steel rail shot forward like a missile. It tore through the front of the car, sliced through the driver's side, and impaled Hannah through her head and chest before pushing her body into the back seat. The car dragged the twisted metal nearly 20 feet before stopping. Hannah died instantly, while the friend beside her survived with only a small cut. What should have been a survivable crash turned into something far more horrifying. Months later, her father, an EMT who had seen countless accident scenes, discovered a darker truth. Just 1 week before Hannah died, Tennessee officials had quietly removed that guardrail model from the approved safety list. They already knew it was dangerous, yet thousands of them still lined American highways. Hannah Immers did not simply die in a crash. She died because something meant to protect her became a weapon. Ashery Ryan, 130 miles per hour through a red light. August 4th, 2022, Windsor Hills, Los Angeles. The afternoon sun hung bright above one of the busiest intersections in the neighborhood. Cars waited patiently at the light while traffic moved normally through the crossing of La Brea and Slauson. Inside one silver Jaguar sat Ashery Ryan, 23 years old and pregnant, driving to a prenatal appointment. Beside her was her boyfriend Reynold Lester, and in the back seat their 11-month-old son Alonzo made quiet baby sounds. Another child, already named Armani, was still growing inside her. It was an ordinary drive in the middle of an ordinary day. But somewhere down the road, another car was approaching far too fast to belong on a city street. A black Mercedes-Benz shot forward like a missile driven by a traveling nurse named Nicole Lorraine Linton. The light at the intersection had already been red for 15 seconds. Still, the car never slowed. Data later showed the speed climbing to 130 miles per hour on a 35-mile road. The crash happened in less than 5 seconds. The Mercedes tore through the intersection and slammed into the Jaguar with catastrophic force. The impact ripped the vehicle apart and triggered an explosion of fire that spread across the road. 9 cars were caught in the flames as gas tanks ignited and debris scattered across the intersection. Witnesses later said it sounded like a bomb had gone off in the middle of the city. When the smoke cleared, 6 lives were gone. Ashery Ryan, Reynold, Lester baby Alonzo, the unborn Armani, and 2 women waiting at the light had been killed instantly. Nicole Linton survived. Investigators later revealed that the accelerator had been pressed even harder in the final seconds before impact. For the families left behind, the question still lingers in painful silence. How could one reckless decision erase so many lives in the time it takes to blink? The Tishomingo 6. One small car, one unforgiving road. March 22, 2022. Tishomingo, Oklahoma. A quiet town where everyone knows each other and news travels fast. That afternoon, 6 teenage girls climbed into a small Chevy Spark during their school lunch break. Music played softly inside the car and laughter filled the seats. They were only 15 to 17 years old, full of the careless energy that belongs to youth. The car was designed for 4 people, but no one inside thought much about that. It was just a short drive through a town they believed they understood. Ahead of them was an intersection locals had long feared. People simply called it the Y. It was where State Highway 22 met US 377A crossing, known for poor visibility and dangerous angles. Residents had warned about it for years, saying it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened there. That afternoon, the girls slowed at the sign and began to pull forward, believing the road was clear. At that exact moment, a massive semi-truck hauling rock thundered down the highway. The truck driver had no time to brake and nowhere to steer. The collision was instant and unstoppable. The truck slammed into the side of the tiny Chevy Spark, crushing the vehicle and pushing it nearly 300 feet down the road. Metal folded glass exploded, and the bright pink steering wheel cover inside the car became one of the few recognizable things left in the wreckage. 4 of the girls died at the scene, including the 16-year-old driver. The other 2 were rushed to the hospital but did not survive. 6 names would forever define that stretch of road: Gracie Machado, Brooklyn Triplet Austin Holt, Madison Robertson, Addison Gratz, and Memory Wilson. The truck driver walked away physically unharmed, and investigators confirmed he had done nothing wrong. But in the small town of Tishomingo, the silence that followed was unbearable. 6 empty desks in school, 6 families broken forever, 1 small car that turned into a coffin on a road that never forgave a single mistake. Jean-Claude Leonard, The Road That Turned Into Fire. October 23, 2015, a quiet forest road in southwestern France. That morning, a small village bus carried a group of retirees on what was supposed to be a peaceful day trip. Friends sat beside each other laughing softly, talking about vineyards and the beautiful countryside waiting ahead. It was the kind of slow journey older couples cherish. A calm road, a gentle curve. Nothing about it suggested danger. Coming from the opposite direction was a heavy logging truck. Behind it sat a tank of gasoline used to fuel chainsaws, something few people on the bus could have imagined. As the truck entered the bend, control was suddenly lost. In seconds, the vehicle jackknifed across the road and slammed head-on into the bus. Metal screamed against metal, and then came the moment that turned a crash into a catastrophe. The fuel tank ruptured instantly. Gasoline spilled beneath the bus and ignited in a violent flash. Flames exploded upward, swallowing the vehicle before most passengers even understood what had happened. Plastic seats, melted smoke filled the aisle, and heat trapped people where they sat. Panic spread through the cabin as elderly passengers struggled to move through choking smoke and unbearable fire. Out of 50 people on board, only 8 escaped. One survivor was 73-year-old Jean-Claude Leonard. He tore off his seatbelt, dragged his wife toward an exit, and fell onto the road just as the bus behind them became an inferno. Against every instinct, he ran back again and again, pulling others free until the flames forced him away. When the fire finally died, 43 lives were gone. The quiet road remained, but for the families left behind, it would forever be remembered as the place where an ordinary journey turned into a furnace. Samantha Miller, The Bride Who Never Made It Home. April 28, 2023. Folly Beach, South Carolina. The wedding had been everything people dream about. Music filled the room, glasses clinked, and friends surrounded a glowing bride. At the center of it all stood Samantha Miller, 34 years old, radiant in her white wedding dress. Beside her was her new husband, Arik Hutchinson. The vows had been spoken. The rings were on their fingers. Their future felt wide open. As the night began to wind down, the couple stepped outside into the warm coastal air. Waiting for them was a small golf cart for a short ride down the road. It was meant to be a quiet moment together after the celebration. Samantha sat beside Arik, her wedding dress spilling over the seat, smiling as she said she wished the night would never end. But down the same road, another car was coming. Behind the wheel was 25-year-old Jamie Komorowski. Witnesses had seen her drinking heavily earlier that night, stumbling and slurring her words. Still, she chose to drive. She sped down the coastal road at 65 miles per hour in a 25-mile zone. Seconds later, the car slammed into the back of the golf cart. The impact was violent. The cart shattered and bodies were thrown into the darkness. Samantha Miller died instantly, her wedding dress torn across the pavement. Arik survived with severe injuries. In court, he said quietly that he wished he had seen the car coming so he could have taken the hit instead. Jamie Komorowski was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but for Samantha's family, a wedding night that began with joy had already become a funeral. The Tesla fire, the car that wouldn't let them out. October 24, 2024, just after midnight in Toronto. Lakeshore Boulevard East was nearly empty when the night suddenly exploded with the sound of screeching tires and violent metal. A Tesla Model Y had lost control, slammed into a guardrail, and then crashed into a concrete pillar at terrifying speed. Within seconds, the vehicle was engulfed in flames so intense that the dark street glowed orange. Inside the car were 5 young friends who had been laughing together only moments earlier. Now they were trapped in a nightmare. The lithium-ion battery ignited and fed the fire with relentless heat. Smoke poured into the cabin while the flames spread faster than anyone inside could react. Panic filled the car as the passengers tried desperately to escape. But the doors would not open. When the electrical system failed, the electronic locks died with it. Tesla vehicles do have manual door releases, but in the chaos of smoke, heat, and fear, seconds disappear quickly. 4 of the passengers never made it out. The car that had been marketed as one of the safest vehicles on the road became a burning steel tomb. 1 person survived. A 25-year-old woman was trapped in the back seat but still conscious as the flames closed in. That was when a passing driver named Rick Harper, a Canada Post worker, saw the inferno. Without hesitation, he grabbed a metal pole, smashed the rear window, and pulled her out through the fire. She survived burned but alive. 4 of her friends did not. In the aftermath, investigators began asking a chilling question. When advanced technology fails at the worst possible moment, how safe are the systems people trust with their lives? Elise buried alive beneath the road. March 6, 2025, Cancun, Mexico. The sun hung bright over the city, the kind of warm afternoon that feels made for celebration. Elise, a well-known family travel influencer who shared her adventures online under the name 3 Kids Travel, had arrived with her husband Dan to attend a wedding. For once, there were no cameras, no travel content to film. It was meant to be a quiet trip, a rare moment to simply enjoy life together. As their hired car moved through traffic, everything seemed normal. But only seconds later, chaos erupted without warning. A truck carrying molten asphalt suddenly lost control. The heavy vehicle slammed into traffic ahead, triggering a violent chain reaction. In moments, 10 vehicles collided in a tangled pile of twisted metal. Elise's car was hit the hardest and flipped onto its side in the middle of the wreckage. Then came the nightmare no one could have imagined. The truck's cargo of boiling asphalt spilled across the road like liquid fire. Thick black tar poured directly into the crushed vehicle where Elise was trapped. The heat was unbearable and the weight of the overturned car pinned her beneath it as the burning material engulfed her body. The crash had happened only steps away from a hospital, yet even trained medical workers struggled to reach her because of the extreme heat. Elise was eventually pulled from the wreck alive but critically injured. Her body had suffered devastating burns while her face remained strangely untouched. She was placed on life support and flown back to the United States, where her family gathered around her bedside. For 6 days, she fought to survive while messages of hope flooded in from around the world. Her daughters braided her hair and her husband played music softly beside her. But on March 12th, Elise died in a burn unit in Salt Lake City. The Carroll County Bus Fire. When a bus became an oven. May 14, 1988, Carroll County, Kentucky. The long day at Kings Island Amusement Park was finally over. Inside a church bus, dozens of teenagers laughed and talked about the rides they had just conquered. 63 children and 4 adult chaperones filled the seats as the bus rolled through the quiet darkness of Interstate 71. Most of the kids were tired but happy, leaning against windows or chatting softly while the road carried them home. Then headlights appeared in the distance. Driving the wrong way down the highway was a pickup truck controlled by a man named Larry Mahoney. He had been drinking heavily for hours. His blood alcohol level would later measure 0.24% more than twice the legal limit. The truck raced forward through the darkness with no sign of slowing. The collision was sudden and devastating. The pickup slammed directly into the front of the church bus, but the worst part came only seconds later. The crash ruptured the bus's fuel tank, which had been dangerously placed near the front steps. Gasoline spilled across the floor and ignited instantly. Flames shot through the doorway and rushed down the aisle faster than the children could escape. Smoke filled the bus as terrified teenagers climbed over seats and pushed toward the only narrow exit. Some collapsed before reaching it. When firefighters finally extinguished the blaze, 27 people were dead, including 24 children. One of them was 10-year-old Patty Nunnally, who investigators later discovered had died from toxic smoke before the fire reached her. Larry Mahoney was arrested and sentenced to prison, but he served less than 10 years and never apologized. The disaster forced major changes in school bus safety across the country. Fuel tanks were moved and fire-resistant materials were added. But for the families of those children, the lesson came at a cost no law could ever repay. George Russell Weller, When a Market Became a Killing Ground. July 16, 2003, Santa Monica, California. Arizona Avenue had been closed to traffic and turned into a lively farmer's market. Colorful tents lined the street. Fresh fruit and vegetables filled the tables. Children ran between the stalls while families walked slowly through the crowd. Nearly 9,000 people filled the open street that afternoon, believing the barricades around the market meant safety. At 1:47 p.m., an elderly man named George Russell Weller, 86 years old, approached the blocked street in his red Buick. As he reached the crosswalk, he clipped a stopped car. It should have ended there with a simple fender bender. But in that moment, panic took over. Instead of hitting the brake, Weller pressed the accelerator harder. The Buick surged forward and swerved around the barricades. In seconds, the car was racing through the middle of the crowded market. Witnesses watched in disbelief as the vehicle tore through stalls, tables, and bodies at terrifying speed. Produce exploded into the air. Shoes flew across the pavement. People were thrown aside as the car traveled nearly 1,000 feet down the packed street. When the car finally stopped, the scene looked like a battlefield. 10 people were dead and more than 70 others were injured, many with life-changing wounds. Investigators later found no alcohol, no drugs, and no mechanical failure. Weller claimed he had simply pressed the gas instead of the brake and could not stop. The city later paid millions in lawsuits and installed stronger barriers across the market streets. But for the families who lost loved ones that afternoon, the damage had already been done. One moment of confusion had turned a place of joy into a graveyard. Kristen Little, The Fall into Silence. August 16, 2024, Prescott, Arizona. The desert sky was slowly turning gold as evening approached, casting long shadows across the narrow mountain road near Thumb Butte. It was one of those quiet places where the world feels far away. Behind the wheel of her car was Kristen Little, 39 years old, enjoying a peaceful drive through one of her favorite landscapes. Sitting beside her was CJ, her miniature German Shepherd and constant companion. Kristen had just celebrated her birthday. Friends described her as adventurous and full of life, someone who loved the outdoors and the freedom of open roads. That evening, the drive was supposed to be simple and calm. The winding dirt road curved gently along the mountain edge with breathtaking views of the canyon below. But on roads like this, beauty often hides danger. Somewhere along one of those curves, the car drifted. There was no long screech of brakes and no warning to nearby drivers. The vehicle suddenly veered left and disappeared over the edge of the cliff. The fall was nearly 1,000 feet. Trees snapped as the car tumbled through the canyon metal, crushing against rocks before everything finally went silent. Rescue teams reached the wreck hours later in the darkness of the mountain terrain. Kristen had been thrown from the vehicle and did not survive. But in the middle of the wreckage, they discovered something no one expected. CJ was still alive. The small dog had survived the fall and stayed close to the crash site through the night as if guarding his owner. It was Kristen's Apple Watch that first alerted emergency services after detecting the violent impact, helping rescuers locate the scene. Technology could not save her life, but it helped bring her home. The Roller Family. The phone call that erased a family. July 21, 2024, West Yorkshire, England. It had been an ordinary afternoon, the kind families rarely remember because nothing seems out of place. Shane Roller, 33, and Shannon Morgan, 30, had just finished a quiet walk with their daughters. They buckled the girls into the back seat of their silver Ford Focus and began the short drive home along the A61. 9-year-old Ruby and 4-year-old Lily chatted happily in the back. It was supposed to be just another routine trip. One child was missing from the car that day. Their eldest daughter Poppy, 11 years old, had stayed behind with a family friend for a longer visit. It seemed like a small and harmless decision at the time. No one could have imagined that it would be the only reason she would still be alive. Coming toward them on the same road was a motorcycle driven by Christopher Barton, 56, with his wife Janine, 48, riding behind him. Witnesses later reported that the motorcycle was attempting to overtake another vehicle. In that moment, the bike crossed the center line and entered the opposite lane. There was no space for the Ford Focus to escape. The collision was immediate and devastating. Metal-twisted glass exploded and the quiet road fell into sudden silence. By the time emergency crews arrived, all 6 people involved had died at the scene. 2 parents, 2 young children, and 2 riders who had never expected their paths to cross. Later that day, a phone rang in a house in Barnsley. Someone had to tell 11-year-old Poppy that her parents and sisters were gone forever. Donations later poured in from strangers hoping to help the girl rebuild her life. But no amount of money could replace the voices she would never hear again. Tina Tintor, 156 miles per hour. November 2nd, 2021. Las Vegas was still glowing under neon lights when the night suddenly turned deadly. The streets were quiet in the early hours of the morning as Tina Tintor, 23 years old, drove her Toyota RAV4 home after dropping off a friend. Beside her sat her dog Max, calm and unaware that they were only minutes away from safety. Tina had spent years rebuilding her life after escaping war in the Balkans as a child. Now she was working toward a future in America and was only days away from receiving her U.S. citizenship. Behind her on the same road came a black Corvette Stingray driven by Henry Ruggs III, a rising NFL star whose speed had made him famous on the football field. That night, the speed was far more dangerous. Police data would later reveal the Corvette racing down Rainbow Boulevard at 156 miles per hour, more than twice the speed allowed on the city street. Ruggs had been drinking earlier that night, laughing with friends without realizing the destruction that was seconds away. At 3:40 in the morning, the Corvette slammed into the back of Tina's SUV with unimaginable force. The crash instantly ignited a massive fire. Flames engulfed the vehicle as metal twisted and glass shattered across the road. Tina and her dog were trapped inside while witnesses heard desperate screams that were quickly swallowed by the fire. Ruggs survived the crash along with his passenger, but Tina Tintor did not. Investigators later confirmed that no one could have survived the inferno created by the impact. Tina had survived war as a child and built a new life in another country only for it to end in seconds because of one reckless decision. Speed had made Henry Ruggs famous, but on that night, it turned a car into a weapon and erased a future that had taken a lifetime to build. The Duvall twins' screams before the fall. May 29, 2016. Maui, Hawaii. The Hana Highway curved along towering cliffs where the ocean met the sky, a road famous for breathtaking beauty and unforgiving mistakes. Driving along that narrow stretch of road was a white SUV carrying twin sisters Alexandria and Anastasia Duvall, both 37 years old. From the outside, their lives seemed glamorous. They were known for running a yoga and wellness business, presenting themselves as calm and spiritually balanced. But that afternoon, inside the vehicle, peace had already shattered. Drivers nearby began noticing something strange. The SUV slowed in the middle of the road with its hazard lights flashing. Inside the car, the 2 sisters were not simply arguing. Witnesses said they were screaming, shoving, and grabbing at each other. One teenage driver later reported seeing Anastasia grab Alexandria's hair while both women fought over the steering wheel. Then the SUV suddenly surged forward. Instead of correcting course, the vehicle accelerated straight toward the edge of the cliff. Within seconds, the car launched off the road and plunged nearly 200 feet down the rocky hillside. The crash echoed through the trees before the wreckage finally came to rest below. Rescuers found Anastasia dead at the scene while Alexandria survived with critical injuries. But the investigation quickly revealed disturbing details. Witness statements described a violent struggle moments before the fall, and investigators discovered strands of Alexandria's hair clutched tightly in Anastasia's hands. Prosecutors later charged Alexandria with second-degree murder, believing the crash might have been deliberate. After a long trial, a judge ultimately ruled there was not enough evidence to prove intent, and she was found not guilty. Yet the mystery never truly faded. Hannah Immer's The Guardrail That Became a Spear. November 1st, 2016, McMinn County, Tennessee. The road was quiet after Halloween night. 17-year-old Hannah Immers was simply driving home with a friend after an evening that should have ended like any other teenage night. Hannah was not racing. She was not speeding. She was a brilliant student, the oldest of 10 children, already holding a diploma at just 15. To her family, she was the responsible one, the girl with a future that seemed almost limitless. Somewhere along the highway, the car drifted slightly. Hannah corrected the steering wheel, but the tires caught the median and the vehicle slid toward the guardrail. It was supposed to be a safety device called the Lindsay X-Light, engineered to collapse during crashes and absorb the impact. It was designed to save lives. That was the promise, but the promise failed. Instead of bending, the steel rail shot forward like a missile. It tore through the front of the car, sliced through the driver's side, and impaled Hannah through her head and chest before pushing her body into the back seat. The car dragged the twisted metal nearly 20 feet before stopping. Hannah died instantly while the friend beside her survived with only a small cut. What should have been a survivable crash turned into something far more horrifying. Months later, her father, an EMT who had seen countless accident scenes, discovered a darker truth. Just 1 week before Hannah died, Tennessee officials had quietly removed that guardrail model from the approved safety list. They already knew it was dangerous, yet thousands of them still lined American highways. Hannah Immers did not simply die in a crash. She died because something meant to protect her became a weapon.
They had fame, money, and millions watching their every move, but none of that could save them from the final crash. In a split second, flashing cameras, roaring crowds, and bright futures were swallowed by twisted metal fire and silence. These are the shocking deaths that left the world stunned. James Dean. James Dean wasn't just a rising star, he was rebellion with a heartbeat. At only 24, he had already become the face of restless youth, a Hollywood outsider with movie star looks, raw talent, and a dangerous love for speed. Audiences saw a legend in the making. No one knew they were also watching a man racing toward his final scene. On September 30th, 1955, Dean climbed into his silver Porsche 550 Spider, the car that would become forever linked to his name. He was headed for a race, chasing the thrill he loved as much as the spotlight itself. With mechanic Rolf Vutherick beside him and friends trailing behind, Dean tore down the California road, as if nothing in the world could touch him. Then in one savage instant, it all ended. A Ford turned into his path. Metal exploded, glass shattered. The young man who looked impossible to kill was suddenly broken in the wreckage. Dean was pronounced dead before the world had time to process what had happened. He didn't just die in a car crash, he became trapped in American myth. The bad boy, the beautiful rebel, the star who burned too hot and disappeared too fast. His life was short, but the image never faded. James Dean left the earth in twisted steel and silence, but the legend roared louder after death than it ever did in life. Anne Heche. Anne Heche didn't just die in a car crash, she vanished in a nightmare of fire, speed, and heartbreak that stunned all of Hollywood. One moment she was still a woman, the world remembered for her fearless spirit, wild honesty, and complicated life in the spotlight. The next, her car tore through a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood, like something out of a disaster film slamming into a home and exploding into flames so massive It took dozens of firefighters to battle the inferno. But what made it even more devastating was that Anne didn't die instantly. She was pulled from the wreckage, fighting for life, trapped in that terrible space between survival and goodbye. For days, hope clung on by a thread as doctors worked, family prayed, and fans around the world watched in shock, unwilling to believe that such a vibrant, chaotic, unforgettable soul could be slipping away. Then came the crushing truth: Anne Heche was gone. Her death wasn't just another celebrity tragedy. It felt raw, cruel, and painfully human. Behind the headlines was a mother, a star, a woman who had spent years battling pain, scrutiny, love loss, and the weight of being misunderstood. In the end, the flames didn't just consume a car. They closed the final chapter on one of Hollywood's most troubled and fascinating lives, leaving behind grief, questions, and a silence that hit harder than anyone expected. Jayne Mansfield. Jayne Mansfield didn't just chase fame, she attacked it like a storm. With platinum hair, a scandalous image, and a smile built for flashbulbs, she became one of Hollywood's most explosive sex symbols. The world compared her to Marilyn Monroe, but Jayne was never content being anyone's shadow. She was louder, bolder, more provocative, an actress, a singer, a showgirl, and a mother, living inside a life that always felt one step away from chaos. Behind the curves, the headlines, and the laughter was a woman fighting to stay unforgettable in a town that devours women as fast as it worships them. By the summer of 1967, her career had cooled, but Jayne still knew how to command attention. Then came the night that turned her name into legend. On June 29th, after a nightclub appearance, she hit the road through the dark with her boyfriend, Sam Brody driver Ronnie Harrison, and 3 of her children asleep in the back seat. The highway ahead looked ordinary. It wasn't. A thick wall of darkness and haze swallowed the road as their car sped forward into the Louisiana night. Then, without warning, it slammed into the rear of a truck with catastrophic force. Steel folded, glass burst. In a single horrifying instant, glamour was ripped apart by violence. Jayne, Sam, and Ronnie were killed instantly. Her children, trapped in the back, somehow survived. What followed was almost as chilling as the crash itself. America didn't just mourn Jayne Mansfield. It turned her death into a nightmare wrapped in rumor. Stories spread that she had been decapitated, a gruesome myth fueled by the wreckage and the horror at the scene. Then came darker whispers, curses, omens, and the eerie legend linking her death to Anton LaVey. Whether true or not, the myths clung to her, because Jayne's life had always lived on the edge of spectacle. In death, she became something even more haunting, a symbol of Hollywood excess, fragile beauty, and the brutal truth that fame can disappear in one violent second on an empty road. Sam Kinison. Sam Kinison had spent years screaming his pain into microphones, turning rage, addiction, heartbreak, and chaos into comedy so explosive it made him a legend. But on one dark stretch of highway, the man whose voice could shake an arena was reduced to silence in an instant. He wasn't leaving a battlefield. He wasn't walking out of a scandal. He was simply on the road, heading toward another show, another night under the lights, until fate came speeding straight at him. The crash was violent, sudden, and merciless. A pickup truck crossed into his lane and smashed head-on into his vehicle, crushing metal glass and whatever future he still had left. In the aftermath, there was no applause, no laughter, no roaring crowd, only twisted wreckage, shock blood, and the horrible realization that one of comedy's wildest souls was slipping away on the side of the road. What makes Sam's death hit even harder is the cruel timing of it. He had already survived so much of his own destruction. The addictions, the self-inflicted ruin, the storms he brought into every room. And yet when it finally seemed possible that he might actually outrun the darkness, life cut him down anyway. That's what makes this tragedy feel so brutal. Sam Kinison didn't just die young. He died at the exact moment when people started to believe he still had more to become. Behind the outrageous persona was a man at war with himself, desperate to be loved, desperate to be heard, and maybe in the end, desperate for peace. His final exit was not just shocking, it was heartbreak in its rawest form, a survivor of his own chaos destroyed by a collision he never saw coming. Paul Walker. Paul Walker lived the kind of life most men only fantasize about. He had the face of a movie star, the soul of a wanderer, and the heart of a man who never stopped moving. To millions, he was Brian O'Connor, the cool, fearless speed demon from Fast and Furious. But off-screen Walker was more than a Hollywood icon. He was a father, a thrill-seeker, a man obsessed with cars, and someone who quietly gave his time and money to people in crisis. He looked like the kind of man who had outrun disaster his entire life. That's what made his ending feel so cruel, so impossible to believe. On November 30th, 2013, Walker attended a charity event for Reach Out Worldwide, the disaster relief organization he founded. It was supposed to be a good day, cars, friends, fans, and a purpose bigger than fame. After the event, he left with his close friend Roger Rodas, a former race car driver, and the man behind the wheel of a red Porsche Carrera GT. It should have been a short drive. Instead, it became a death sentence. Moments later, the Porsche lost control at terrifying speed, slammed into a curb, tore through trees and a light pole, and burst into flames with horrifying force. By the time anyone reached the wreck, there was almost nothing left to save. Paul Walker and Roger Rodas were both dead. The shock hit like an explosion across the world. Fans didn't just lose an actor, they lost a face that had come to symbolize loyalty, adrenaline, brotherhood, and freedom. The tragedy felt even darker because it mirrored the very world that made him famous: speed power, and the illusion that some men can dance with danger forever. But real life doesn't hand out second takes. It doesn't cut away before the crash. Paul Walker's death froze the world in one awful moment, twisted metal, fire, smoke, and silence where a heartbeat used to be. Lisa Left Eye Lopes. Lisa Left Eye Lopes had always lived like a storm, brilliant, unpredictable, wounded, and impossible to ignore. She wasn't just the fiery soul of TLC. She was a woman carrying pain, fame, rebellion, and a restless spirit that seemed forever caught between self-destruction and salvation. And in the final days of her life, that tension felt almost eerie, as if something dark was already circling her. She had gone to Honduras, searching for healing, for clarity, maybe even for peace. But instead of escape, what waited for her is a horrifying end on a lonely road. In a sudden burst of chaos, Lisa lost control of the SUV, swerving violently as the vehicle rolled and tore across the earth. Metal twisted. Bodies were thrown. And just like that, one of music's most unforgettable voices was gone at only 30 years old. What makes Lisa's death feel even more haunting is everything that surrounded it. There was already tragedy in the air, pain, guilt, strange coincidences, spiritual warnings, and the sense that she was trying desperately to outrun something inside herself. She wasn't just another celebrity caught in a fatal crash. She was a woman wrestling with demons the public could sense but never fully understand. That's why her death didn't just shock fans, it unsettled them. It felt bigger than an accident. It felt like the final chapter of a soul that had been burning too hard for too long. behind the headlines was someone deeply human, fragile, intense, loving, reckless, and aching to be free. Lisa didn't leave the world quietly. She left behind questions, grief, and a silence that felt almost unnatural because voices like hers aren't supposed to disappear that fast. They're supposed to keep burning. They're supposed to survive. Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith didn't just sing the blues, she dragged pain into the light and made the world listen. Born into poverty, hardened by loss, and fueled by a voice that could shake the walls of any room, she rose to become the undisputed empress of the blues. She wasn't polished, delicate, or built for polite society. She was raw power. Every note she sang sounded lived in, torn from heartbreak, survival, and a life that refused to break quietly. By the time America knew her name, Bessie had already turned suffering into legend. But even legends can bleed. In September 1937, after years of fame, scandal, and relentless touring, Bessie was traveling through the Mississippi night with her companion Richard Morgan. The road was dark, the hour was cruel, and what happened next felt like the kind of ending no one would dare write for a woman who had fought so hard to be heard. Their car collided with a slow-moving truck, ripping open the journey in one violent instant. Metal screamed, glass shattered. Bessie was left catastrophically injured on the side of the road, her body broken, her future slipping away under the cold indifference of the night. But the tragedy did not end with the crash. It deepened. Around her final hours grew stories tangled with racism, neglect, and the brutal reality of America at the time. Rumors spread that treatment was delayed because she was black, turning her death into something even more haunting than an accident, a symbol of a country where talent could make you famous, but not necessarily safe. Whether in truth, myth, or the painful space between them, Bessie's end became larger than one wreck on one road. It became a wound in cultural memory. She died as she had lived, surrounded by hardship, shadow, and the sound of a world too cruel for a voice that powerful. And yet even death could not silence her. Because Bessie Smith left behind more than songs, she left behind a roar that still echoes long after the road went quiet. Princess Diana. Princess Diana didn't just die in a car crash, she disappeared into one of the most haunting nights the modern world has ever witnessed. She was the woman millions adored, the princess, who turned pain into grace, scandal into strength, and royal distance into human warmth. But on that final night in Paris, behind the flashing cameras and the desperate chase, the fairy tale shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. What began as another night under relentless public scrutiny became a nightmare of speed, steel, and terror. Diana's car raced into the darkness with paparazzi close behind, and in seconds, everything was destroyed inside a tunnel that would become infamous forever. The wreckage was catastrophic. The silence afterward was worse. The woman who had once seemed untouchable, photographed, followed, worshipped everywhere she went, was suddenly fragile, broken, and slipping away from the world that had never stopped watching her. That is what makes Diana's death feel so devastating, even decades later. It was not only tragic, it was cruelly symbolic. A woman hunted by attention until her very last breath. A mother, an icon, and a wounded soul who had spent years carrying humiliation, loneliness, and pressure beneath a perfectly composed smile. In the end, the world did not just lose a princess. It lost a living paradox, someone glamorous yet deeply lonely, powerful yet painfully vulnerable, adored by millions yet never fully protected. Her death sent shockwaves across continents because it felt bigger than loss. It felt like betrayal. The kind that leaves behind flowers, tears, conspiracy rage, and an ache that never fully fades. Diana's story didn't end like a legend should. It ended in shattered metal, blinding flashes, and a silence so heavy the whole world could feel it. Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly looked like she had stepped out of a dream the world never wanted to wake up from. She was elegance made flesh, cool, radiant, untouchable. Hollywood adored her. Directors framed her like a masterpiece. Audiences watched her with the kind of fascination reserved for women who seemed too perfect to belong to real life. Then she did the impossible. She walked away from fame, married Prince Rainier III, and became Princess Grace of Monaco, turning a movie star fantasy into a royal fairy tale. But the most beautiful stories often hide the darkest endings. By September 1982, Grace was no longer just a screen legend. She was a wife, a mother, a princess, and a woman carrying the quiet weight of a life lived under constant public gaze. On September 13th, she left the family's country home with her daughter, Princess Stephanie, and began the drive back to Monaco, along the steep, winding roads above the coast. It should have been an ordinary return home. Instead, it became the final, terrifying descent of an icon. Somewhere along that narrow mountain road, Grace reportedly suffered a medical episode behind the wheel. In an instant, control was gone. The car veered off the roadway and plunged down the rocky hillside below. Steel crumpled, glass shattered. The fairy tale broke open in silence and violence. Stephanie survived. Grace did not. She was pulled from the wreck alive but gravely injured. Her body devastated, her future already slipping away. The woman once lit by flashbulbs and palace chandeliers now lay at the center of a tragedy too cruel, too cinematic, too brutal to feel real. And as always happens when legends fall, rumors came crawling in behind the grief. Questions, whispers, speculation about what truly happened inside that car. But no rumor could outshine the heartbreak of the truth. One of the most admired women in the world was gone, not on a red carpet, not in front of a camera, but on a lonely curve of road. Grace Kelly lived like a fantasy, but she died in a nightmare, leaving behind a shattered kingdom of sorrow and a final image the world has never forgotten. Cliff Burton. Cliff Burton didn't die under stadium lights or in the glorious chaos of a final encore. He died in the freezing dark, thrown from a tour bus, and crushed in a nightmare so sudden, so brutal, it still feels unreal decades later. He was only 24, young, brilliant, and already the soul of Metallica, the rare musician whose bass didn't just support the music, it gave it teeth, depth, and a kind of dangerous beauty no one else could fake. That night in Sweden was supposed to be nothing more than another stop on a hard, relentless tour. Another road, another ride, another chapter in the rise of a band that seemed destined to conquer the world. But somewhere in that cold silence, fate turned vicious. The bus lost control, skidded and flipped, hurling Cliff out into the dark before the vehicle came crashing down on top of him. In seconds, one of metal's brightest young minds was gone, not in a blaze of glory, but in twisted steel, black ice, and horror. What makes Cliff's death so haunting is not just how violent it was, but how much future died with him. He wasn't simply a bassist. He was the creative force pushing Metallica beyond speed and aggression into something deeper, darker, and unforgettable. His talent felt limitless. His instincts were fearless. And that is what makes the loss so cruel, the sense that the world never got to see how far he could have gone. For the band, it wasn't just an accident. It was an emotional detonation. A brother was gone. A piece of their identity was ripped out on the side of a foreign road. And for fans, Cliff Burton became more than a musician. He became a ghost in heavy metal history, a symbol of raw genius, taken too fast, too young, and in a way so merciless, it still hurts to imagine. Aaliyah. Aaliyah didn't leave the world. In scandal, chaos, or decline, she was taken at the exact moment her future looked unstoppable. She was young, radiant, untouchably cool, and already evolving from music icon into something even bigger. Her voice was soft, but her presence was powerful. She didn't need to scream to own a room. That's what made her loss feel so cruel. She wasn't fading. She was ascending. On that final trip back from the Bahamas, what should have been a simple flight home turned into a nightmare no one saw coming. Minutes after takeoff, the plane went down in a violent, catastrophic crash, killing Aaliyah and everyone else on board. There was no time for goodbyes, no final performance, no slow farewell. Just wreckage, fire, shock, and the unbearable collapse of a life still filled with momentum. What made Aaliyah's death hit so hard was the innocence of it. She wasn't a star known for self-destruction. She wasn't spiraling in public. She was disciplined, elegant, and deeply admired, with an image built not on scandal, but on mystery, grace, and quiet power. That's why the tragedy felt so unfair. It didn't feel like the ending of a troubled celebrity story. It felt like the violent interruption of something beautiful that had only just begun. Behind the fame was a daughter, an artist, and a young woman whose calm exterior hid fierce ambition and enormous potential. Her death didn't just shock the music world, it left a wound in pop culture that never fully closed. Because some losses feel bigger than death. They feel like stolen futures. And Aaliyah became exactly that, a shining star, frozen forever, at the moment the world was ready to see how far she could truly go. Naya Rivera. Naya Rivera didn't die in a blaze of headlines. At first she vanished into silence, and somehow that made it even more terrifying. To the world, she was fierce, magnetic, and impossible to ignore, a woman whose confidence could light up a screen and cut through a room in seconds. But in the end, there were no cameras close enough, no audience, no warning. Just open water, a drifting boat, and a disappearance that turned into one of Hollywood's most heartbreaking tragedies. What made it so devastating was the cruel simplicity of it. This wasn't a high-speed crash or a public meltdown. It was a quiet day on the lake with her young son, something ordinary, something innocent, something that should have ended with laughter and a safe return to shore. Instead, it became a nightmare. Her son was found alone on the boat, waiting while Naya was gone. And in that single detail, the tragedy became almost unbearable. The actress millions knew as bold and fearless spent her final moments making sure her child survived. That is why Naya's death cut so deeply. It wasn't only shocking, it was profoundly human. Beneath the fame was a mother, and in the final chapter of her life, that identity mattered more than anything else. She didn't leave behind scandal as much as sorrow. Not spectacle, but sacrifice. And that made the loss feel heavier than most celebrity deaths ever do. Naya Rivera's story ended not with applause, but with still water, unanswered cries, and a silence that broke people's hearts. She was taken far too soon, but in the most painful way possible. Her final act revealed exactly who she was: brave, loving, and unforgettable. Crashes happen every day, fading into numbers most people never remember. But some don't disappear. Some leave behind questions that linger, stories that feel too disturbing to ignore. Tonight, we're stepping into moments where everything changed in seconds, where love control and ordinary choices collided with something darker. These are not just accidents. These are real lives, real endings and details that will stay with you long after the road goes quiet. Edwin Borea, March 7th, 2025. Just before sunrise in New Jersey, the roads were quiet, almost empty, the kind of calm that makes everything feel predictable. Edwin Borea, a 66-year-old former Olympian, was driving along his usual route, likely expecting nothing more than another ordinary morning. He had lived a full life representing his country in the Olympics, raising a family, building a career. There was nothing about that moment that suggested it would be his last. But somewhere ahead, something was already going wrong. Another driver, Brian Baldari, was moving in the opposite direction, but not where he was supposed to be. His car was traveling at extreme speed, far beyond what the road allowed, and worse, in the wrong lane. For miles, he continued like that, closing distance, with every second turning a normal highway into a path toward disaster. There was no warning Edwin could react to in time. No signal, no chance to avoid what was coming. In a single instant, two paths crossed in the worst possible way. The impact was immediate and overwhelming, setting off a chain reaction that involved multiple vehicles and left the roadway in chaos. What had started as a quiet morning turned into a scene no one could have anticipated. In the days that followed, Edwin fought to survive, surrounded by family who knew how much he had already given to the world. But this wasn't a battle he could win. Ksenia Alexandrova, July 5th, 2025. A quiet road stretching through the Russian countryside. The kind of drive that feels calm, almost peaceful. Inside a luxury car, Ksenia Alexandrova sat beside her husband, heading home after what should have been just another ordinary trip. But Ksenia was not just anyone. She was a model, a former beauty queen, a woman who had built a life full of ambition, education, and purpose. Only months earlier, she had gotten married, stepping into a future that seemed full of promise. As the car moved through the open road, nothing seemed out of place. No warning, no sign of danger ahead. And that's what makes this moment so unsettling. Because sometimes the most devastating events don't build slowly. They arrive instantly, without giving you time to react. In a single second, everything changed. Out of nowhere, a large animal burst onto the road. There was no time to brake, no space to avoid it. The impact was immediate and overwhelming, turning a controlled drive into chaos. The windshield shattered, and the force of the collision struck directly where Ksenia was seated. What had been a quiet journey became a fight for survival in the blink of an eye. In the days that followed, hope held on even as the situation grew more critical. Her husband stayed by her side, waiting, believing she might recover. But some injuries go beyond what anyone can see in the moment. And what makes this story linger isn't recklessness or bad decisions. It's the randomness of it all. The idea that everything can be taken away, not because of what you did, but because of something you never saw coming. Daniel Waterman, February 9th, 2025. Super Bowl weekend in Florida, the kind of night filled with noise, excitement, and celebration. For 22-year-old Daniel Waterman, life was just beginning to take a new direction. Sitting beside his girlfriend, Leah Mumbi, he had just learned he was going to be a father, a daughter, a future he couldn't stop thinking about. But inside that car, something was already shifting. what should have been one of the happiest nights of his life was slowly turning into something far more dangerous. It started with a message. A simple text from a female friend back in New York, harmless on the surface, but enough to spark tension. The mood changed. Voices rose. Words sharpened. As the car moved along the highway, so did the argument, growing heavier with every mile. Daniel later said he could feel it, something wasn't right. The way she spoke, the way she drove it all began to feel unpredictable. Then control started to slip. The speed increased. The road blurred. What was once just an argument became something else entirely. Daniel tried to react, tried to create distance, but there was nowhere to go. In that moment, emotions took over the wheel. The car surged forward faster and faster, pushing past the point where anything could be taken back. The crash changed everything. In seconds, a future filled with plans became a fight for survival. Daniel didn't walk away. He spent months in recovery, holding on to one goal: to go home to meet his daughter. But some battles are too heavy even for those who refuse to give up. And in the end, what makes this story stay with you isn't just how it ended. It's how quickly something so ordinary turned into something no one could stop. Ginimbi Genius Kadungure. November 8th, 2020, just before dawn in Harare, Zimbabwe, the night hadn't ended yet. Music still echoed, champagne still lingered in the air, and Ginimbi Kadungure was exactly where he had always been, at the center of it all. Wealth, influence, and a lifestyle built on excess had made him a symbol of success to some and controversy to others. That night, he left his own nightclub the same way he lived his life: fast, loud, and unstoppable. He stepped into his Rolls-Royce Wraith, a machine built for power and presence, not caution. Inside the car were three others, including socialite and influencer Michelle Moana Amuli. Moments earlier, everything felt untouchable. Social media posts captured smiles, energy, a night that seemed far from over. But the road outside didn't care about status, followers, or money. It only responded to speed and control. Witnesses later described the Rolls-Royce moving aggressively, overtaking vehicles, pushing beyond what the road could safely allow. In seconds, that confidence turned into something else. A sudden collision, a loss of direction. The car spun out of control and slammed into a fixed point with overwhelming force. What followed happened faster than anyone could process, turning a luxury vehicle into something unrecognizable. In the aftermath, the shock spread far beyond the crash itself. A man who seemed larger than life was gone along with those beside him. The story dominated headlines not just because of who he was, but because of what it revealed. Behind the image of control was a moment where everything slipped. And in that moment, the illusion ended. Tsortsis Monoios. January 13th, 2022. A quiet coastal road just outside Athens where the night felt still and the streets were nearly empty. For Tsortsis Monoios, this wasn't just another drive. It was the moment he had been waiting for. After years of success, he had finally taken ownership of a Ferrari 488A machine built for speed, precision, and raw power. Sitting beside him was his wife, Athena. The drive was supposed to be short, controlled, unforgettable for all the right reasons. From the moment the engine started, everything changed. The sound alone carried a kind of promise, a sense that this car was different from anything else on the road. As they moved along the narrow coastal stretch, the Ferrari responded instantly to every touch, every movement. But roads like these are not designed for hesitation. They demand accuracy, awareness, and respect for every second behind the wheel. Then something shifted. Reports suggest a sudden reaction, possibly an attempt to avoid something ahead. At high speed, even a small adjustment can turn into a critical loss of control. The Ferrari veered off its line, leaving no room to recover. In a fraction of a second, precision turned into chaos. The car struck a fixed object with overwhelming force, ending the drive almost as soon as it had begun. What followed unfolded too quickly for anyone to stop. The vehicle was heavily damaged, and despite immediate response from those nearby, the outcome had already been decided. Athena survived, pulled away from danger just in time. Tsortsis Monoios did not. Cristobal Flores Espino and Robert Leroy Rocha. December 2021. A typical afternoon in Dallas, Texas, where school had just ended and neighborhoods were filling with life again. Parents were picking up kids, students were walking home, and traffic moved slowly through familiar streets. It was the kind of environment built for safety, where speed limits weren't just rules, but protection. And yet in the distance, something didn't belong. Witnesses heard it before they saw it. A deep, aggressive engine cutting through the calm, growing louder by the second. A McLaren 570S, a car engineered for racetracks, not residential roads, came tearing through the street at extreme speed. In a place where children had just been walking minutes earlier, the margin for error was already gone. Inside the car were Cristobal Flores Espino and Robert Leroy Rocha. What they felt in that moment was likely power adrenaline control. But high-performance machines don't forgive mistakes, especially in environments they were never meant for. In an instant, traction was lost. The car veered off course, leaving the road with unstoppable momentum. The impact was catastrophic. The force alone tore the vehicle apart, scattering debris across the street and leaving behind a scene no one could fully process at first glance. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but the outcome had already been decided. What remained was silence shock, and a community trying to understand how something so fast entered a place that was supposed to be safe. What makes this story linger isn't just the speed, but the setting. This wasn't a highway. This was a neighborhood. Because when power meets the wrong place, the result isn't just loss of control. It's a reminder that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how strong the machine or how confident the driver feels. Marcus and Melissa Crowtley, September 2023. The sun hung low over the winding roads of Sardinia, Italy, casting long shadows across a convoy of exotic cars. Engines roared in unison as a group of wealthy drivers carved through the countryside, each one chasing the same promised speed, luxury, and the illusion of total control. Among them were Marcus and Melissa Crowtley, a couple who had spent years building a life that allowed them to be part of moments like this. It wasn't recklessness in their eyes. It was an experience. They sat inside a red Ferrari Portofino, surrounded by machines just as powerful, just as unforgiving. The road ahead was narrow, lined with curves that demanded precision. But in a convoy like this, patience begins to fade. One slow vehicle up ahead changed everything. A camper van forced the line of supercars to reduce speed, and with that came tension. One by one, drivers began to overtake, ignoring the markings that warned against it. Then came the moment that couldn't be reversed. A Lamborghini surged forward at the wrong time, and Marcus followed, committing to a move that left no margin for error. In seconds, the balance between control and chaos disappeared. The Ferrari collided, veered off the road, and struck the terrain with violent force. What had been a coordinated drive turned into confusion and shock. The aftermath unfolded quickly, but not quickly enough to change the outcome. Other drivers stopped rushing toward the wreck, but the situation had already escalated beyond reach. The scene that remained was a stark contrast to what had begun as a luxury experience. Mario Bonilla and Kendrick Lang, October 2nd, 2022, just after midnight, in a quiet neighborhood in St. Petersburg, Florida. The streets were empty, the kind of silence that makes everything feel safe. Most people were asleep, unaware that something was already unfolding in the shadows. Three teenagers moved through the darkness, not looking for trouble, just opportunity. Then they found it. A white Maserati unlocked keys inside. In that moment, everything changed. None of them had a license. None of them understood what that car was capable of. But temptation doesn't wait for experience. They climbed in, laughter replacing hesitation, adrenaline replacing logic. When the engine started, it wasn't just a car anymore. It was power they had never felt before. And once they pulled away, there was no going back. Above them, a sheriff's helicopter had already spotted the vehicle. Deputies followed from a distance, watching, waiting. But inside, the Maserati, panic began to build. The driver pressed harder on the accelerator. Speed climbed rapidly, far beyond what the streets could handle. Houses blurred past. Intersections disappeared. What felt like control was already gone. Seconds later, everything collapsed. The vehicle lost stability, leaving the road and striking obstacles with overwhelming force. The motion stopped, but the consequences didn't. Emergency crews arrived within minutes, but the outcome had already been decided. What remained was a scene that made one thing clear. This wasn't about luxury or speed or even rebellion. It was about a single moment where excitement replaced judgment, and the cost of that moment could never be undone. Alexei Dolgich. November 2025, just after 1:30 a.m. in Moscow. The city was asleep, but the highway was wide open. Streetlights stretched endlessly into the distance, creating the kind of road that feels like it belongs only to speed. Inside a Lamborghini Urus, Alexei Dolgich wasn't just driving, he was pushing limits the same way he had built his life. A successful crypto entrepreneur, known for bold moves, and a lifestyle that ignored boundaries, he treated the road no differently. The SUV surged forward with brutal power, its engine echoing through the empty highway. Dashcam footage would later reveal just how fast he was going, far beyond what the road was designed to handle. Inside the vehicle were friends, passengers, trusting the moment, trusting the driver. But speed has a way of rewriting reality. What feels controlled at first begins to shift almost invisibly until control is no longer part of the equation. As the vehicle approached a highway exit, everything tightened. Curves demand precision, and at that speed, even the smallest miscalculation becomes critical. In a single instant, the balance broke. The tires lost grip, the vehicle veered, and the massive SUV turned from machine into momentum. What followed happened too fast for correction, too fast for recovery. The aftermath left a scene that spoke for itself. The vehicle built for dominance had no answer for physics when limits were pushed too far. 2 lives were lost, others left fighting to survive, and the highway returned to silence as if nothing had happened. But what makes this story linger isn't just the speed, it's the pattern behind it. Warnings ignored, limits tested again and again, until one moment finally refused to forgive. Giovanna Ramos race. November 9th, 2025. Just before sunrise in São Vicente, the night was fading, but the energy hadn't disappeared yet. Music from the concert still lingered in the air as Giovanna Ramos Reis stepped outside with her friends, laughing, holding on to the last moments of a night that felt perfect. At 26, she was full of life, surrounded by people she trusted. When she suggested they all leave together, no one hesitated. It felt like the safest choice. It felt right. Behind the wheel was someone familiar, someone no one questioned. The car pulled onto the highway, quiet at that hour, almost empty. But something wasn't right. One of the passengers noticed it first. The speed, the slight loss of focus, the subtle signs that the driver wasn't fully in control. Still, the car kept moving forward. No one stopped it. No one realized how quickly the situation was slipping away. As they approached a curved access road, everything narrowed. Space-time control. In a single moment, the driver misjudged the turn. The vehicle left the road crossing terrain it was never meant to touch. What followed happened in seconds, too fast to process, too fast to escape. The journey that was supposed to end at home turned into something no one could reverse. The aftermath left more than just questions. It left silence where there had been laughter minutes earlier. Friends, families, and a community trying to understand how something so simple became something so final. Jeffrey Lo Chong Hao. March 2nd, 2025. A quiet Sunday afternoon in Singapore, where traffic moved in steady rhythm and everything felt controlled, predictable. Jeffrey Lo Chong Hao, a 37-year-old business executive, was doing something completely ordinary driving home. Meetings ahead, plans in motion, a life built on structure and discipline. Behind the wheel of his Porsche 911, nothing about that moment suggested it would be his last. But speed has a way of rewriting ordinary moments. Witnesses and dashcam footage would later reveal a different version of that drive. The Porsche wasn't moving with traffic, it was cutting through it. Faster, sharper, pushing past limits that most drivers never approach. What feels smooth at high performance can quickly become unstable when the margin for error disappears. As the car approached the expressway entrance, everything tightened. Lanes narrowed, vehicles clustered, and timing became critical. Then, in a single instant, control broke. The Porsche veered abruptly, crossing from one side to the other, with no clear recovery. What followed happened too fast for anyone nearby to react. The vehicle struck the divider, and the sequence of events that followed turned motion into chaos. Other cars were caught in the aftermath. Drivers who had been following the rules suddenly pulled into something they couldn't avoid. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but the scene had already been decided. What remained was a stark contrast to how the day had begun, calm replaced by confusion, routine replaced by finality. Pedro Caíque Ventura Figueiredo. Just after midnight in São Paulo, the streets were nearly empty, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel louder than it should. Pedro Caíque. Ventura Figueiredo, only 21 years old, was riding his motorcycle home following a route he knew by heart. He wasn't chasing speed, not looking for attention. He was simply going back to his life, his family, his responsibilities, his future waiting for him at the end of that road. Behind him, something else was building. A yellow Porsche, powerful, fast, and driven by someone who saw the road differently. What started as a minor moment, a brief contact, a small scratch, should have ended there. For most people it would have. But that night, it didn't. Instead of letting it go, the driver chose to follow, to accelerate, to turn a passing incident into something far more dangerous. The distance between them closed quickly. The road, once empty and calm, became a space filled with tension. What began as irritation shifted into intention. Witnesses and footage would later show how fast things escalated, how quickly a simple decision transformed into something irreversible. In a single moment, the pursuit reached its end. The impact changed everything. A life built on effort, family, and purpose was cut short in seconds. The car continued forward, but the consequences stayed behind, echoing far beyond that road. DJ Hisni Kestaj. March 31st, 2024. Late afternoon on a highway between Switzerland and Italy, the road stretched wide and open under a bright sky. For DJ Hisni Kestaj, life had always moved fast, music travel crowds and constant motion. That day was no different. After a performance, he got behind the wheel of a white Ferrari, a machine that matched his lifestyle, powerful, loud, and impossible to ignore. Beside him sat Anna Kravska, young, hopeful, and trusting, the journey ahead. At first, everything felt effortless. The car responded instantly, the road seemed clear, and the speed began to rise. Witnesses would later recall how fast the Ferrari was moving, far beyond what the highway demanded. But inside the car, it likely didn't feel dangerous yet. That's the illusion of speed. It builds quietly, making everything seem smooth until the moment it isn't. As the Ferrari continued forward, something shifted. At high speed, even the smallest miscalculation becomes critical. The car lost stability, drifting beyond control in a fraction of a second. There was no time to correct, no space to recover. What followed happened instantly, turning precision into chaos and motion into something final. The aftermath left a silence that felt heavier than the speed that came before it. Two lives ended on a road that moments earlier felt completely under control. Hey, thrill seekers, step into the moment where control slips and everything changes in a heartbeat. Tonight, we're not chasing adrenaline, we're confronting the dark side of it. One drink too many, one reckless choice, and suddenly, the night fractures into sirens, shattered glass, and lives that will never be the same again. These aren't just stories, they're real, raw, and devastating. Think it won't happen to you? Think again. Because once the line is crossed, there's no undoing what comes next. Lane Garrison. December 2nd, 2006, Beverly Hills, where bright lights, fast lives, and second chances collide. Lane Garrison was only 26, fresh off the success of a hit TV show, finally stepping into the spotlight he had chased for years. That night, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like freedom. Music parties, strangers turning into friends. It was the kind of night that seems harmless until it isn't. Outside a liquor store, Lane met three teenagers. They were young, curious, drawn to the energy surrounding him. What started as a casual encounter quickly turned into something more dangerous. Alcohol was passed around. Boundaries blurred. And as the night moved forward, the line between responsibility and recklessness quietly disappeared. No one stopped to think about where this was heading. At some point, they all got into his SUV. The city lights stretched across the road ahead, but control was already slipping away. Investigators would later reveal that Lane had been drinking and using substances before getting behind the wheel. In his mind, he was still in charge. But reality doesn't wait for you to catch up. In a sudden, irreversible moment, the vehicle left the road and slammed into a tree. Silence followed, heavy, permanent, unforgiving. A 17-year-old boy, Vahang Setian, who had his entire future ahead of him, didn't survive. Two young girls in the back seat were left seriously injured, their lives forever altered. And Lane, once rising in Hollywood, now faced a completely different reality, one defined not by fame, but by consequences. What makes this story hit harder is how ordinary it began. No plan for destruction, no intention to harm, just a series of small, careless decisions stacking up until there was no way back. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the crash. It's the belief that nothing bad will happen before it does. Ryan Dunn. June 20th, 2011, long after midnight in Pennsylvania, the road stretched out empty and silent, the kind of road that invites speed and dares you to push limits. Ryan Dunn knew that feeling better than most. He built a career on risk, on doing what others wouldn't dare, on turning danger into entertainment. That night felt no different. Drinks had been poured, laughter shared, and somewhere between confidence and carelessness, a line was crossed. He got behind the wheel of a high-performance car, a machine built for precision but unforgiving in the wrong hands. Beside him sat his friend Zachary Hartwell, someone who trusted the moment, trusted the driver, trusted that they would make it home. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, speed took over. What starts as control can disappear faster than anyone expects, especially when judgment is already blurred. Investigators later revealed just how fast the car was moving, far beyond what the road could safely handle. In a single instant, that speed turned into something else entirely. The vehicle left the road, and what followed was not just a crash, but a complete loss of control that ended everything where it stood. Two lives, two stories, both cut off in the same moment, leaving behind shock, grief, and questions that would never fully be answered. What makes this story so unsettling is not just the outcome, but the pattern behind it. This was not the first warning, not the first risky decision, not the first time speed and alcohol had mixed. But like so many others, it felt manageable until it wasn't. Keith Moon. January 4th, 1970. A small pub in England filled with noise, laughter, and the kind of energy that comes from a night meant to celebrate. Keith Moon, the legendary drummer of The Who, was there, not as a global rock icon, but as a guest supporting a local opening. Still, wherever he went, attention followed. His presence, his attitude, his lifestyle, it all stood out. And as the night went on, so did the tension around him. Alcohol flowed freely, and the atmosphere slowly shifted. What started as celebration turned uneasy as a group in the crowd grew hostile. Words, looks, and quiet resentment built into something more aggressive. Sensing the situation changing, Moon and his group decided to leave. It should have ended there. Just another wild night, nothing more. But outside, the chaos was waiting. As they reached the car, the situation escalated fast. The vehicle was surrounded, shaken, struck, turning a retreat into panic. In that moment, decisions were no longer calm or calculated. They were instinctive. Moon, not known for driving and not prepared for the situation, took the wheel in an attempt to escape. Fear replaced logic. Urgency replaced awareness. What happened next unfolded in confusion and darkness. In the attempt to get away, his bodyguard Neil Boland was caught in the chaos behind the car. By the time everything stopped, the celebration had turned into tragedy. A life was lost, not through intention, but through a chain of fear, pressure, and split-second reactions that no one could take back. The court would later rule it an accident, but not everyone accepted that conclusion. Questions lingered, doubts remained, and for Keith Moon, the weight of that night never truly disappeared. Those close to him believed it changed something deep inside, pushing him further into the same reckless patterns he was already known for. Vince Neil. December 8, 1984 was supposed to be the beginning of something big. Hanoi Rocks had finally broken into the American scene, their momentum building their future wide open. That night, music, laughter, and alcohol filled the air inside a California beach house. It felt like celebration, like success finally within reach. But sometimes the moment everything seems to be coming together is the exact moment it all starts to fall apart. As the night went on, the drinking didn't stop. When the alcohol ran out, Vince Neil, frontman of Motley Crue, made a decision that felt small at the time, just a quick drive to get more. He grabbed his keys. Razzle, the band's charismatic drummer, jumped in the passenger seat. No one thought twice. No one stopped them. And in that ordinary, careless moment, the future quietly shifted. The streets were dark, the car moving fast, and control began to slip. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but echoed for decades. A sudden collision. A violent stop. Silence where there should have been music. Razzle, full of life just moments earlier, was gone. In another vehicle, two young people were left with devastating injuries that would follow them forever. For Vince Neil, the consequences came quickly, but for many, they never felt enough. Legal outcomes can be measured in days, months, or money. But the weight of a life lost that lingers in a different way. The music world paused, fans mourned, and a rising band lost its heartbeat before it ever reached its peak. What makes this story so unsettling isn't just the tragedy, it's how easily it began. Not with anger, not with intent. Just a simple choice made in a moment of confidence under the illusion that nothing would go wrong. But sometimes the most dangerous lies we believe are the ones that tell us we're still in control. Amy Locane. On the night of June 27, 2010, in a quiet New Jersey neighborhood, everything looked painfully normal. Fred and Helen Seaman had just returned from a weekend away and were slowly turning into their driveway only a few feet from home when an approaching car came in far too fast. In one instant, the calm was shattered. What should have been the safest part of their journey became the moment that changed everything forever. Behind the wheel was Amy Locane, a former actress once known for her Hollywood promise and television fame. Years earlier, she had stood in front of cameras, admired for her talent and charm. But that night, the spotlight was gone, replaced by flashing emergency lights and the sound of consequences closing in. Investigators later found that she had been drinking heavily and driving at a dangerous speed through a residential area where families expected peace, not disaster. What makes the story so haunting is not just the crash itself, but the chain of choices leading up to it. Witnesses had noticed signs that she was impaired. There had been chances to stop, chances to hand over the keys, chances to make one responsible decision. Instead, the night kept moving forward until there was no way to take anything back. Helen Seaman lost her life, and Fred was left to survive the kind of loss no courtroom can truly measure. For Amy Locane, that single night erased any clear line between celebrity and accountability. The case dragged through the courts for years, becoming a lasting reminder that fame does not shield anyone from the weight of reckless decisions. And that is what makes this story impossible to ignore. It did not begin with violence or chaos. It began with someone believing they could still stay in control right up until the moment control was gone. Marco Mozzo, September 27th, 2015. A calm Sunday afternoon in Ontario. The kind of day where nothing feels dangerous and everything feels routine. Inside a family minivan, the Neville Lake family was enjoying a simple outing, 3 young children in the back, their laughter filling the quiet space. It was an ordinary moment, the kind people never think twice about, because nothing about it suggested that within seconds, their lives would be torn apart in a way no one could ever repair. At the same time, Marco Muzzo was returning from a bachelor party, carrying the aftermath of hours of heavy drinking. He had continued drinking even on the flight home, fully aware that he was not in any condition to drive. But awareness did not stop him. Somewhere between confidence and recklessness, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He got behind the wheel of his Jeep and entered a residential intersection without slowing down. What happened next unfolded with brutal finality. Driving at high speed, he ran through a stop sign and collided directly into the side of the minivan. The force of the crash turned a peaceful afternoon into a scene of chaos and irreversible loss. Emergency responders arrived quickly, doing everything possible, but some moments are beyond saving. 3 children lost their lives along with their grandfather. 2 others survived, but with injuries that would forever remind them of that day. In the aftermath, the shock spread far beyond the crash site. A mother was left to face the unimaginable reality of losing her children in a single moment. A community struggled to understand how such a preventable tragedy could happen. And at the center of it all was one undeniable truth. This was not fate or chance. It was a choice made despite knowing the risk. Samuel Davidson. February 1st, 2020, a quiet suburban street in Sydney. The kind of place where children walk freely and families feel safe without thinking twice. That afternoon, a group of kids stepped out together, heading to a nearby shop for ice cream. It was simple, innocent, and ordinary. Laughter, footsteps, sunlight on the pavement. Nothing about that moment hinted at danger approaching at high speed, just seconds away. Behind the wheel of a blue Mitsubishi, Samuel Davidson had already crossed multiple lines long before reaching that street. From early morning, he had been drinking heavily, mixing alcohol with other substances, gradually losing any clear sense of judgment. Witnesses would later describe his driving as chaotic, speeding, swerving, ignoring traffic signals as if the rules no longer applied to him. By the time he entered the residential area, control was already slipping beyond recovery. As the road curved downhill, his speed climbed far above what the street could handle. In a place designed for safety, his vehicle became a threat no one could escape. In a single devastating moment, he lost control and mounted the curb, striking the group of children from behind. The impact changed everything instantly. 4 young lives were gone and others were left injured, their futures permanently altered by a decision they had no part in. What followed was a wave of grief that spread across an entire nation. Families were left with questions no answer could satisfy, and a community struggled to process how something so preventable could become so final. Yet within that pain, something unexpected emerged. The father of 3 of the victims chose to speak not with anger, but with forgiveness, a response that stunned many and challenged how people understood justice. Olivia Culbreth. February 9th, 2014, just before dawn in California, the freeway stretched out in the darkness, carrying early drivers toward another ordinary day. Inside one vehicle, a family of 4 was traveling together, unaware that within moments, everything would change. At the same time, in the opposite direction, Olivia Culbreth made a decision that had already crossed the line between risk and disaster. She had been drinking, and despite knowing the danger, she got behind the wheel. What makes this moment even more unsettling is how fast it escalated. Driving at extreme speed, she entered the freeway going the wrong way, turning a routine road into a path of unavoidable impact. Calls began flooding emergency lines drivers reporting a car heading directly into oncoming traffic. There was no time to react, no space to escape. In seconds, two paths collided with devastating force, ending multiple lives in a single instant. The aftermath was overwhelming. A family was lost together, their journey ending where it should have been safest. Others caught in the crash were left injured, confused, trying to understand what had just happened. Olivia survived, but survival came with consequences far beyond physical wounds. She became the only one left to face the reality of that night, a reality shaped by one decision made under the influence. As the case unfolded, the focus was not only on the crash itself, but on the pattern behind it. Prior warnings, previous violations, moments where things could have changed direction. Yet none of them were enough to stop what eventually happened. Stephen Schwally, June 28, 2024. A warm Friday afternoon in Long Island, where people moved through their day without a second thought. Inside a busy nail salon, conversations flowed, phones buzzed, and customers relaxed in their chairs, preparing for the weekend ahead. Among them was an off-duty police officer getting ready for a wedding later that evening. It was the kind of ordinary moment that feels completely safe, completely routine. Until, without warning, that sense of normal disappeared. Outside, Stephen Schwally was already on a different path. Earlier that day, he had been drinking, continuing a pattern that had followed him for years. Witnesses later described his driving as erratic, fast, and unpredictable, as if control was no longer part of the equation. Still, he kept going. Through parking lots, past pedestrians, ignoring the quiet rhythm of the area around him, moving closer to a moment that could no longer be avoided. Then it happened. His vehicle left the roadway at high speed and surged directly into the salon. In a single instant, the space that once felt calm and ordinary became a scene of chaos. People had no time to react, no chance to understand what was happening before everything changed. Lives were lost, others were seriously injured, and the impact reached far beyond the walls of that building. In the aftermath, questions came quickly, but answers felt incomplete. Witnesses spoke of the speed, the warning signs, the behavior that suggested something was wrong long before the crash. And yet, none of it was enough to stop what followed. Nicholas Devon Robinson. February 21st, 2025, just after midnight in Miami Beach. The city was still alive with music lights and late-night traffic. On the side of the MacArthur Causeway, a young college student, Gabriela Flores, sat inside her disabled Jeep waiting for help. Moments earlier, a police officer had assisted her in moving the vehicle out of traffic. It should have been a safe pause, a brief delay before continuing her night. Nothing about that moment suggested how quickly everything was about to change. Not far away, Nicholas Devon Robinson was celebrating his birthday, moving between bars, drinking, and stepping further away from clear judgment with each passing hour. At some point, he made the same decision seen in so many tragedies before him. He chose to drive. Witnesses would later describe a car moving at extreme speed, far beyond what the road allowed, cutting through the night with no regard for what lay ahead. As Robinson approached the causeway, the situation escalated in seconds. His vehicle veered, struck a divider, and continued forward with unstoppable force. Gabriela's Jeep, stationary and out of traffic, suddenly became the center of impact. In an instant, a moment of waiting turned into a life-ending collision. Emergency crews responded immediately, but some outcomes cannot be reversed once they begin. In the aftermath, confusion surrounded Robinson's behavior. Officers noted signs of impairment, while witnesses struggled to process what they had just seen. For Gabriella's friends who had been standing nearby, the loss was immediate and deeply personal. A young woman focused on her future, her education, her life ahead was gone because of a decision she had no control over. Rebecca Grossman, September 29th, 2020, a quiet evening in Westlake Village, California, where families walked together under the fading light. Two young boys, Mark and Jacob Iskander, were crossing the street with their parents just steps away from home. It was the kind of moment that feels completely safe, completely routine. But safety can disappear in seconds when someone else decides the rules don't apply. Behind the wheel, Rebecca Grossman, a well-known socialite, had been drinking earlier that night. Witnesses later described two speeding vehicles racing down the road, engines roaring through a residential area where children lived and played. In that moment, speed and alcohol combined into something far more dangerous than either alone. As her vehicle approached the crossing, there was no time to react. The impact came suddenly, violently, and without warning. The two boys were struck in a place meant to protect them. A family outing turned into a scene no parent should ever have to face. The neighborhood fell silent, replaced by shock sirens and disbelief. In the aftermath, the case drew national attention, not just because of who she was, but because of the choices that led there. Questions of accountability, privilege, and responsibility surfaced again and again. Because when power meets recklessness, the consequences don't disappear. They echo louder. Matthew Broderick, August 5th, 1987. A narrow road in Northern Ireland where visibility was limited and the margin for error was thin. Actor Matthew Broderick was driving a rental car during a vacation, accompanied by actress Jennifer Grey. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, far from cameras and attention. But even in the calmest settings, one mistake can change everything. Driving on unfamiliar roads, Broderick drifted into the wrong lane. In a place where every second matters, that small lapse became critical. An oncoming vehicle approached with no space to avoid what was about to happen. In an instant, two paths crossed in the worst possible way. The collision resulted in the deaths of two women in the other vehicle, a mother and daughter whose lives ended on a road they had traveled many times before. What makes this case so haunting is how quickly a simple driving error turned into a permanent loss for an entire family. Broderick later faced legal consequences, but the incident remained tied to his name for decades. It stands as a reminder that not all tragedies begin with recklessness alone. Sometimes it's a combination of inexperience, pressure, and a momentary lapse that leads to irreversible outcomes. Laura Bush, November 6, 1963. A quiet intersection in Midland, Texas, long before the world would know her name. Laura Bush, then a teenager, was driving through a familiar area, a place she had likely passed through many times before. It was an ordinary day, the kind that never feels significant until something changes it forever. As she approached the intersection, she failed to stop at a stop sign. At that exact moment, another vehicle entered the crossing. The collision that followed was sudden and unavoidable. Inside that vehicle was a close friend from her own community, someone whose life ended in that single moment. What makes this story deeply human is not just the event itself, but the weight it carried afterward. Laura Bush rarely spoke about it publicly, but those close to her, they understood the lasting emotional impact. A single mistake made in a familiar place became something she carried quietly for years. This case reminds us that tragedy does not always come from extreme behavior. Sometimes it comes from a moment of inattention, a missed sign a second too late. And in that second, everything changes in ways that can never be undone.